Admiral Yamamoto gave a quiet nod in the direction of the screen. The bursts of light flared and died in the dark the same as the Starship Friendship years before. His stony expression never changed as the lights died under the wave of darkness. His tongue was bound by the sanctity and brutality of the moment. His hands remained folded behind his back, and he recalled one of the horror movies he saw in theaters that came out 3 years after the destruction of Friendship at First Contact. In it, the destruction of the Ediaxa ships failed to kill those who sailed within, and they flew in to attack the Terran ship, resulting in fierce fighting and the hunting down of most of the men and women on board. Why do I love such god-awful movies? He asked himself with a shake of his head, but he then glanced in the direction of the sensor operator and said aloud, "Life signs?" "None, sir." The answer was calm and professional, as was to be expected of their bridge officers. But out of the corner of his eye, the Admiral saw the little smile on the man's face. "Did you lose someone?" John asked with quiet reverence and a hint of curiosity, and the Major answered at once, "My big brother." The officer's response was no surprise. Some of their top performers were relatives who joined the new defense force, specifically in the hopes of avenging what was done to a loved one. The Admiral didn't offer condolences. Most people had heard enough of those over the years. Instead, he gave a slight tug to his uniform and reseated himself. "Helm, adjust course. Head to the nearest Yadyaxa system. They have an energy collector that we need to collect." The Admiral's order was followed by the feeling of the starship banking slightly toward the hyperlane, and the brief feeling of acceleration before the dampeners could cycle out the force and the stars became a blur. They went from dots to lines as the fleet streaked through the night along the thickened space lanes. It would still take 3 months of travel to reach their destination, but he had one advantage he was sure the Yadyaxa did not. "We've got a good idea of their territory, and I'm certain they have no idea what Earth has been up to these last 7 years. Oh well, they fucked around. Now they find out." Admiral Shaya's mind was haunted by the absolute destruction of their punitive force, but he took comfort in the fact that the Kaksak was a wise female, whose guidance had never steered them wrong in the past. The Hulians, the Matrak, the Lorxa, all gave their territory a wide berth because of her aggressive policy of destroying vessels that entered territory the Yadyaxa desired. However bad things might have seemed, they could be worse. "We still have the rest of the armada, and we have our shipyards fully automated. They began building vessels as soon as the first ones were destroyed. Also, they must supply themselves from afar." Those were comforting thoughts to cling to as he stilled his wings and lowered his whole body to the floor in front of the Cax's throne, and gave his report of events. The throne room of their homeworld was a dimly lit place. It kept the vibrant colors of visitors dulled, but the throne was the exception. There, light was always streaming through a series of windows which angled the light directly toward the throne and nowhere else. As a result, the ruler was always the brightest in the room, a display that never failed to put others into a state of awe. And it did not fail now as he explained it all and awaited her answer. "We will meet them with swarms. Their ships are large and powerful," she admitted, "but they fire few shots. If they cannot hit, they cannot kill. We need only be many, and in this way the bugs may conquer the beast." She didn't lose her temper. Though the long tongue that vibrated out her words was stiffer than usual, he couldn't help but admire her collected state, and the rapidity with which she came up with a strategy that might have some possibility of success. "I will see to it personally, my Kaksa," the Admiral vowed, and she only fluttered her wings in acknowledgement. The bright colors danced along the floor thanks to the rainbow her wings created, and he crawled back out the way he'd come to prepare to resist the alien invaders. Mentally, Shaya had already cast off any hope of defending the first solar collection stations, and he ordered only skeleton crews of expendable ne'er-do-wells to be left behind to put up at least a show of defiance. The little fleets were ordered to pull back while the shipyards went into overdrive, churning out small, cheap frigates that required little to no crew, while also adding a small number of slightly more powerful vessels that still had less in terms of firepower and more in terms of maneuverability in their favor. Day after day he prepared. Working with only his most trusted aides, he watched every transmission that came his way. In the second lunar cycle of the homeworld, he saw the human fleet emerge from the hyperlane and go straight for the collector. It had few weapons, only enough to defend against pirates or destroy asteroids that came their way, which meant 2 platforms and a central rotating gun connected to the power core. The humans bathed the guns in the light of their weapons, and then docked their ships. Shaya swapped to the internal monitors to watch the battle. In contrast to the soft bodies of the frail prey, he remembered, these were almost a different breed. Large, powerfully built, and clad in thick armor, the human marines carried large guns tipped with sharp blades. They shouted as they came on, their weapons spitting bright beams down the hall, and Shaya felt a core of fear grow in his gut. The human marines were moving in small teams that seemed to have been drilled on how to maneuver through the halls of a Yadiaxa construct. How did they know this much? He wondered. It just didn't seem likely that they would coincidentally use the same construction methods as his people. They've studied us somehow, figured out how we build. He felt vaguely ill as he watched the professional motion of the soldiers who moved in a leapfrog pattern, with 2 on the walls firing with 1 standing and kneeling, then 4 in the center moving up under suppressive fire on the wings. The center group would then provide fire for the next 2 to move up, and the halls were captured 1 by 1, and 2 by 2 until the last expendable defender died with a hole in his brain. They are orderly, professional, a warrior species, Shaya thought, and that thought stayed with him for the next 3 months as he watched the shipyards produce more and more and more, until they had 50 ships to the humans' 1. By then, however, the human strategy was clear. Collector after collector had been captured, and they were forming a ring around the core worlds of Yadiax, cutting off supplies from outlying mining stations. If they want to win, though, they have to attack, which means they'll face us in our strongest position, complete with starbase support and our entire armada. Once we defeat their fleet, we can reclaim the lost ground. And so the stars twinkled on. The entire population of the core 3 worlds of their home system were devoted wholly to preparing to defeat the aliens. Without our subject peoples, the labor is harder, but we are the Yadiaxa. We will not fall. He vowed and wondered idly, what are they doing with the primitives we conquered before their coming? The loss of slave labor and scientific test subjects had hurt, but he continued to think of it as a mere temporary thing. He and all his high command were breathing hard as they sat in council with the Caxa on the day the last outer collector was reported to have been captured. We have prepared as best we can. Our fleet is stationed directly at the hyperlane entry. They can come from no other place. As soon as they do, they will be swarmed. The Admiral explained, and the Caxa's wings fluttered. We have the best weapons we can create, the best ships, and our crack crews are trained and ready to fight. Admiral Shaya, you have performed your duty well. When the time comes, you are authorized to act unilaterally in the reclaiming of our systems and in the negotiations of peace with the invaders. Destroy the human fleet, then take it all back. So says the Caxa, she declared, and his wings fluttered with involuntary release of joy at her faith in him. His council of high officers were clearly full of envy. Their tongues all stiffened in place as he replied to her, I accept your Radiance's orders and will not fail you. It was such an unprecedented honor that in spite of the state of things, Admiral Shaya thought of himself as happy. When the humans arrive, we will show them why we have never lost a war before. He vowed and waited for word of their coming. It was 3 lunar cycles before he realized something with absolute horror. They're not coming. The Yadiaxa fleet was the strongest it had ever been, but their entire strategy had hinged on one thing, that the humans would attack. It's just common sense, of course they'll attack. They have to. How else do they expect to win if they don't? He asked, as he stared dumbly at the screen. Each of the trio of worlds were structured solely around the construction and maintenance of ships. Even their starbase had been modified to ensure the maximum number of ships could be maintained. The Terran fleet had not changed much, with only a handful of large battleship signals showing as having come to reinforce the one identified as Admiral Yamamoto. In addition, the solar collector there had been expanded into a support base with a shocking degree of speed. and according to the signals, it had a number of weapons platforms to augment the human armada's fighting force. Thus bottled up, Shaya undertook an unusual stratagem, taunting. The face of the human admiral appeared on his screen when their connections linked up. "I did not know you were so afraid of us. Perhaps you would care to surrender now and save the lives of your soldiers?" Shaya said without wasting time on pleasantries. "Perhaps," Admiral Yamamoto replied. "I will consider your request and reply within 3 of your lunar cycles." The transmission was then cut. Shaya could hardly believe it. Are they cowards after all? He wondered, and sought to consult with the only one who was in his estimation wiser than himself. "Agreed. It is a strange thing. But they are aliens," the Kaksa answered. Her confused fluttering was as much relief as worry in the Admiral's mind. "Perhaps such surrender practices are common. We know little of these creatures beyond that they are hardy survivors." And so they waited. 3 cycles passed by again, and the human Admiral's transmission came in on the very last day since his initial request. "Do you submit, or do we fight?" Shaya asked. "Nuts," Yamamoto answered, and the transmission died again the same as before. What exactly that meant consumed ample thought and ample time, but when there was no movement of the human fleet, one thing Shaya was sure of: the humans simply weren't coming, and this time he didn't need to go to the Kaksa. She summoned him. "Are we under siege?" the Kaksa asked him directly. "I believe this is what they call it. They show no signs of moving to attack us. It makes no sense. What do they wait for? Are they building more ships?" he asked. It didn't seem likely. Such massive ships had to have a high cost. "Perhaps they are fighting somewhere else." There were only 2 certain things. The humans weren't coming, and the system could not support any more ships. It was 2 more lunar cycles before the Kaksa called him into her private chamber. Her wings drooped, her tongue was limp, her body was drooping as badly as her wings, and the Admiral's horror seemed to have no impact on her demeanor, as if she didn't even register it. "We are beaten," she said at once, and Shaya's tongue went so stiff he couldn't vibrate a word. The Kaksa didn't need his question to know what it was. She put the answer on screen. It was their economic forecast for the next 3 cycles. "Our materials all go to the fleet. Our soldiers produce nothing, but they must train and eat every day. Our ships must be maintained, and materials spent on that are not spent on our infrastructure. We have been cutting corners expecting a decisive battle that could turn this all around, but you can cut only so much from the top before there is nothing left to cut. Our hospitals are not able to care for the sick. Our citizens are growing weary, suicides are up, the cocooning is down. To meet food demands, we used chemical growth acceleration, but the soil is growing weary. We had to pull 3 ships from the fleet to hover over the most depressed cities to keep order. Soon we will have to pull more. Our front will weaken." She inhaled deeply and exhaled hard. "How is the maintenance of the fleet?" Forced by her question to say something, Shaya spoke the truth. "Suffering. We have been on constant alert since the last collector was taken. Even crack troops become sloppy when kept on such hours for long enough. Mistakes are up by 48%. Half of those destroyed intact spare parts. It won't be long before we reach total economic collapse. The fleet cannot be maintained, and our scientific research has been underfunded. We can no longer hope to upgrade our fleet, even if we had a breakthrough. We cannot afford to create or install new equipment. This was their strategy, leaving us to destroy ourselves. Can we not at least send out what we have? If we gamble it all on one fight, if we can destroy their fleet here, then we can still reclaim all that was lost. Your Radiance." Shaya all but begged, but he could see his words had little impact. "Would you in their position have been idle this whole time?" she asked, and his tongue stiffened in dismay. "She's right. Even if they equipped only modest weapons of their sort on our captured arrays, our swarms will be diminished in every battle until we are beaten, and surely they will have reinforcements on the way before we've taken even the second one. And that assumes we survive the first fight with a still intact swarm." Shaya's mind reeled at the implications. "I will do it myself," the Kaksa said, slid the pad across to him so he could initiate contact with the Terran. Admiral Jonathan Yamamoto's face remained unchanged from their last interaction. "Admiral," the human said, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Shaya couldn't bring himself to leave it to the Kaksa herself, so he spoke in her place. "We are beaten. Name your terms, invader." Shaya said, his pleading eyes cast up to the Kaksa. Her head hung in the second defeat of her life. She fluttered her wings to tell him to continue. "We want what we wanted 7 years ago. Payment for the lives lost to compensate the families and the government for the destroyed ship. An official apology for your unprovoked aggression, and a treaty of peaceful non-aggression to ensure this does not happen again, and the ones responsible for the attack must be handed over to us. If we do this, your fleet goes back, and you return our taken territories," Shaya asked. "The fleet will be diminished, but a defense force will be kept docked at the base where we are now stationed, and we will return nothing. That is the price of war. Do you accept?" The human's steely eyes seemed to peer into Shaya's soul. The admiral of the Yadiaksa felt his wings droop. "We do. We are sorry that we began our contact with you by aggression. We accept the fault for this war, and will repay you as you ask. But I must say, to be beaten this way, I never foresaw." He stopped speaking when the human admiral nodded. "Our people learned a few things long ago that were instrumental in our triumph today. 1. Who knows when to fight and when not to fight, need not fear the result of 100 battles. 2. That fighting without fighting yields the greatest victories. 3. That you should never interrupt an enemy when he is making a mistake. I will send a formal treaty to you within the hour," Jonathan Yamamoto said, stood up and leaned forward toward the screen. "You may be tempted to violate it when my fleet here is diminished in number, but I promise you, we are prepared to sign the next treaty on your homeworld in person with whatever remnants of your government survive our next retaliation." "We abide," Shaya answered. His eye went to the Kaksa, whose drooped wings and downcast air told him she had no intention of even trying for revenge today, or any time soon. "I'm sure you do," Jonathan said, and the transmission died as surely as the hope Shaya had for the future. With the transmission dead, the screen showed the map of Yadiaksa territory. Only the core worlds remained. The Empire was reduced to a state it had not been since they first set out into the stars to settle, explore, and conquer. They don't even need to spend vast sums on star bases to keep us confined. We can't afford to raise a large enough armada to be a threat, not anymore. Our fleet will have to be dismantled down to a fraction of what it once was, or our whole society will collapse in on itself. What of us will survive if we turn on one another?" There was no good answer there. "What will become of us now, Your Radiance?" Shaya asked of their ruler. "As you said, we abide. Perhaps someone will overthrow them, and we can rise again. And if not, we must do our best to survive in the shadow of man. Else we die in their coming flames. And I do not wish to lead us into the flames a second time." Her words were different than they ever had been in all the years of knowing her. And as such, they rang true to him even where another would find them difficult to accept. "Recall the fleet. His treaty has arrived already. We must make the best of this. Whatever that means, even I know not anymore." She gave the order, and his drooped wings as he signaled his obedience, and went to carry out her will, wondering himself what would rise after the twilight of the Yadiaksa Empire.